Thank you. Good evening. You are all in store for a real exceptional treat here this evening because you're going to get to see a really remarkable piece of work before other people have seen it, understand how these kinds of pieces are created and evolve, and you're going to hear from the artists that have made this possible, and you're also going to hear some terrific performances from some really great singers. In order to get it started, my job is to introduce to you the composer who is one of the principal forces behind this opera. And it's a real pleasure for me because I've come to know Mohammed Fairouz in a variety of capacities because he is an individual with an extraordinary number of talents. And if you go and you follow music, you know he's one of the great rising stars among composers anywhere in the world today, that he was the youngest person ever to get a full Deutsche Grammophon album devoted to his work, that he's been called a post-millennial Schubert, that he is an extraordinary array of accomplishments despite his relatively young age. I don't think he's going to like that I said relatively young, but his relatively young age. Four symphonies. How many of you have 4 symphonies under your belt? But what strikes me about Mohammed is the breadth of his interests and the breadth of his capacity. And I think you're going to see that here tonight. He has actually written for Foreign Policy magazine, just as he's written for the New York Times, on a variety of subjects. He is politically attuned, he's socially attuned, he's an excellent writer, but best of all, he's got a great heart. And when you listen to his music and when you listen to him speak, you will sense that great heart is at the center of all the success he's had so far. Please join me in welcoming Mohammed Fairouz to the stage.
This is how our drama ends. Machiavelli, betrayed, rejected, and tortured, strips off the muddy clothes of every day and puts on the robes of court and palace. In this grave address, he finally crosses over into an eternal study that is illuminated as though it is the very font of thought and life. He enters the courts of the ancients. As I composed this final scene of my latest opera on a libretto by David Ignatius, I find myself working hard to visualize what this court of the ancients might actually look like, who its inhabitants might be. Being fully immersed in this drama has brought me face to face with the everlasting enigma that is Machiavelli, parsing his personality, teachings, his thoughts, and consistently coming back to the contradictions of his views and their applications. Trying to penetrate the puzzle of his mind has forced me to ask hard questions about the nature of human genius and its universality, questions about the viability of his teachings over the long arc of history, questions about the nature of chaos and order, and of course questions about the poles of what we experience as human beings, those being fear and love. What this has required us to do is to stage the creation of a new world in the theater, resulting in broad strokes of analysis and art. After setting the stage, the three main acts or chapters of this opera serve as a sort of control experiment, charting deeply personal human experiences and their sociological ramifications. Sometimes the mirror that art holds is held very intimately, while at other times it reflects the largest possible image. My hope is to give you a tour of the world that we have made and shed some light on the question, why Machiavelli? At the outset, allow me to take a moment to address the form of my work, so as to clarify why I chose opera. The reason why I chose opera as my medium, and also, frankly, because I get many questions from well-meaning observers as to whether I write in a Western or Eastern style. The answer is that I attempt to create art in a style that is honest to my experience of the world, which I'm fortunate to say has been transnational. My musical language is cosmopolitan out of necessity. It is what I know. I value my studies of the Western classics with the late Gunther Schuller as much as I value my study of Arabic maqam with the late Sheikh Haboush. I don't value one or over the other. They're both part of my richness. As for why opera, the answer is simpler. Opera, for my purposes, is the means to tell a story through the utilization of music, words, movement, lighting, visual design, acting, singing, etc., etc. These are all part of universal human genius. Though I've heard exclusivistic arguments, cultural arguments everywhere from Japan to the Middle East to Europe and the United States, the reality of the matter is that nobody can claim a monopoly on the human voice, on music, on words, and though I'm sure someone somewhere has attempted to do it, nobody can really claim the monopoly on light or human movement. I use the term opera or lyric theater, though I drive towards a global musical style. I use those words because I like those words. Opera simply means work, and though I admit that Wagner's old term Gesamtkunstwerk, or all-inclusive total art form, might be the most accurate descriptor of a show that encompasses all the different arts, it's a little bit doctrinaire for my tastes, so I'll stick to opera or drama. Now that we've got our definitions out of the way, please meet Machiavelli. The year is 1513. The place is Florence. Machiavelli has just been tortured by the Medici. He tells his muse, Fortuna, what he saw. The masterpiece that he refers to is, of course, The Prince, finally published in the year 1532, 5 years after Machiavelli's death. In his final interaction with Fortuna, his muse, in Florence, she entreats him to search for her over centuries. And Machiavelli passes into another place, where he watches the passage of time and the recursive folly of human conduct. He sees empires rise and fall, great leaders brought down by personal scandal, revolutions fail, and frightful masses goaded into civilizational war. The next time we meet him, the year will be 2032. In a world that is as different as it is fundamentally similar to the Florence that Machiavelli left, a place called Amoraesiopia. I'd like to say a few words about the context and atmosphere of our play. When Machiavelli awakens in the year 2032, he's in this place. Amoraesiopia, the setting for our drama, is not entirely a figment of my imagination. It can best be understood as a global meta-kingdom, held together by the international tri-capitals of Miami, Dubai, and New Maoistan. I imagine that they're linked together through a trans-Amoraesiopeian railroad, but that's just me. What we can immediately see, though, is that the focus of our world has shifted southward. At 25 degrees north, Miami and Dubai share the same parallel, while the third of our tri-capitals, New Maoistan, sort of meta-Shanghai, sits on the 31st parallel. Interestingly, all three of the tri-capitals derive their names from their relationships to water. The name Shanghai results from a combination of two Chinese characters that, taken together, mean upon the sea. The most commonly accepted explanation for the name Dubai is that it comes from the Arabic word yedib, which refers to the ebbing of water on the creek, while the name Miami traces its origin to the Maya people's own name for themselves, the downstream people. All three of the tri-capitals imply a subversion of the traditional centers of power, in both the national and regional sense. There was a time when the established and orthodox capitals of culture and growth in the Arab world, Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, chief among them, could refer to the Gulf Arab states as nothing more than tribes with flags and get away with it. The Emirati writer and public intellectual Sultan al-Qasimi had conducted a compelling study of the shift of focus away from these historic capitals to the prosperous nations of the Arabian Gulf in his lecture titled The Rise and Rise of Gulf Cities. But even within this environment, the wild, wild east of Dubai supplants the slow and steady national capital of the United Arab Emirates, Abu Dhabi, as well as the regional powerhouses of Riyadh, Jeddah, and Doha. Miami shifts the focus away from the traditional American political and economic capitals of Washington and New York, respectively, and moves the center of power southward. Perhaps after the Second American Civil War takes its toll on the northern capitals and unleashes Miami's growth as it's freed from the constraints of US federal regulations on labor, construction, immigration, and so on. In China, too, our focus of power shifts from Beijing, which literally translates as the northern capital, to the Yangtze River Delta in hyperdrive. The YRD, which currently is dominated by Shanghai, also incidentally houses Nanjing, China's ancient southern capital. The initial setup of Amerasiopia is through this symmetrical 6-note musical figure. Sounds like this. So my choice of 6 notes, as well as this obsessive symmetry, even if you don't read music, you can see that this is exactly symmetrical and mirroring one another, is inspired by the ultra-ordered 6-lane structure of Dubai's Sheikh Zayed Road, which is seen here is repeated twice as a mirror image moving in opposite directions from one another, just as in the Amerasiopia musical motif. Minimalistic use of musical figures in a repetitive way can also be used to suggest a sort of rhythm and movement, oftentimes terrifying rhythm and movement to the design that takes us into a place that evokes Dubai's obsession with form and order. Here's another view of Sheikh Zayed Road. There's nothing earthy about this technologically mad future of steel and glass. What characterizes our Amerasiopia is a breakneck obsession with construction as well as a sense of history that has to be constantly renewed or reinvented. This approach to the past forces our tri-capitals to remain entirely and eternally driven to the future, never backward-looking. The current competition in Dubai between the tallest tower in the world, the Burj Khalifa, and the new superstructure at Dubai Creek Harbor that'll overtake it in 2020 reminds me of New York's once upon a time love affair with the sky. The age when Al Smith, having witnessed the rise of the Bank of Manhattan building and the Chrysler building, and after having seen the collapse of the stock market, defiantly declares that his empire state will outdo them all. Our tri-capitals represent boundless ambition and relentlessly forward-looking vision. Their towers are unsatisfied with hugging the sky. They want to pierce and colonize it. The spirit of Amerasiopia can be captured in its president, Wu Vertu's mantle of leadership. Freedom, security, dignity, prosperity, rivers of concrete, the future in bloom. Yeah, fine words, but if lessons from recent episodes in Chinese, Russian, and American approaches to governance can be taken as cautionary lessons for the future, the concepts and meanings behind these words do not always coexist harmoniously. The trick is in good governance, walking the tightrope of balancing seemingly contradictory civic desires without falling into the trap of extremes, or the trap of the chaos that we create. Here I should also note that this is not set in the present day. Present-day Dubai, with its example of business as a way to govern society, provides a positive model. So just as in the days when New York City rose to the sky, the influence of commerce on statecraft, coupled with the prioritization of social well-being and an educated citizenry, can yield success stories, this foundation in current Dubai is sort of coupled with its pragmatic approaches to dealing with the economies of the West, the subcontinent, the Asia-Pacific region, as well as where it's positioned with regards to the new potential opening up of the Iranian economic frontier, not to mention the promise of renewed commitment to growth in Saudi Arabia. But in 2032, Amerasiopia is in a state of disarray. And it is in this environment that President Wu Vertu arrives, in the largest of the tri-capitals, New Maoistan. Machiavelli's muse and publisher, Fortuna, she seeks to prepare him for the life or death task of advising this new prince, whose kingdom is rocked by faction and the threat of imminent collapse, and whose private life is tainted with scandal.
Now all we need is a prince, a worthy, needy prince on whom we can advise on how to be wise.
Amidst this protest and unrest, our unhumble prince arrives here in Hyotus New Maistan.
Where?
You called it Shanghai, one of the tri-capitals of Ethiopia, along with Miami and Dubai. Our
He needs advice. Composing the meta-kingdom has involved a healthy mix of analysis and imagination. David Ignatius's libretto demands the invention of nothing less than a new genre, which I can best describe as a cross between geopolitical sci-fi fantasy and a traditional morality play. Realizing this vision is more than just a pedantic exercise, so thank you for bearing with me. It is an opportunity to conduct the particular sort of profound and searching study of the human experience that only true artistic enterprise can demand of its creators. I want you to meet Wu Vertu, the new leader of the world. Wu Vertu is a combination of several well-known dictatorial prototypes, synthesized in a way that produces a figure who's at once surreal, larger than life, and familiar. Wu embodies the spirit of our tri-capitals. And as such, the music of his introductory number, Wu Vertu is my name, aims towards a global, once again, or Amerasian musical style. Wu is the dystopian strongman of the future, the sort of ruler who could have cancer and try to pass it off as a leadership skill. Wu Vertu is a mix between a Chinese president who envisions himself an emperor, an Arabian leader who sees himself as a caliph, and an American president turned demagogue. The dance sequence preceding Wu's arrival, this is the tail end of it, juxtaposes the asymmetrical chaos that menacingly threatens to unravel his kingdom with the obsessively ordered symmetry of Amerasiopia, that familiar 12-note lane hyperhighway. Here, the collision is most explicit. The following 7-measure phrase up there is made up of 7 asymmetrical measures, groups of 7 and 5, followed by symmetrical 6-measure phrase, the Amerasiopia theme, that can easily be broken down into 2, even 3-measure groups, in which each measure to boot, so we're operating on the atomic level here, consists of more ordered groups of 6, 3, 2. So this is explicit here. Take a listen. Order. So when Wu begins to introduce himself, the music actually moves through distinct sections that evoke inflections of the tri-capitals. The musical techniques that I use here start with a traditional East Asian pentatonic, Specifically, if you're into this sort of thing, the Chinese Shang scale with one altered note. It's followed by the classic harmonic progressions of traditional national anthems and hymns of state, those tunes that are designed specifically for their simplicity and memorability so that they can be easily remembered and sung by pretty much anyone. And then this is followed by a Western pentatonic, as Wu describes as sort of new global manifest destiny, before it finally switches into an ancient Arabian maqam called, that's a musical mode, called Hijaz. The musics maintain their own individual marks, but are made to meld with one another in this style of the Amerindian cosmopolis. The fluidity with which the different idioms flow into one another also functions for me as a sort of character painting. It's a musical commentary on President Wu's chameleon-like qualities. Wu repeats each of his statements twice, with minor musical variation affecting the rhythm and tone of his delivery the second time. This device, some of us might recall from our old rhetoric lessons, is called antenoclasis, right? It's used in advertising, sloganeering. It tends to be the dominant style that dictators, and demagogues use to communicate what Auden described as the elderly rubbish they talk. Sometimes the intention is to arbitrarily delay one word the second time around so that the assembled audience can feel a sense of accomplishment in filling it in as though they hadn't just heard it. We know our global destiny is no accident of history. We know our global destiny is no accident of history. So that's fine. While at other times, it's just a poor rhetorical substitute for a well-thought-out argument, as though the second iteration of a statement, no matter how inchoate, is truer in its repetition just by virtue of its being said twice in a row. Here's mover 2. His new prince and president in a way that shows his colors as a master sycophant, manipulator, and hungry consultant. We all know this person. He's the needy speechwriter, an aide, desperate to be published and loved, eager for his leaders to hear his counsel, He's the national security advisor, convinced that his advice needs to be heard on pains of the demise of state. He's the journalist desperate to get on the campaign jet. He's the opinion writer anxious to be on all the morning talk show programs. And he uses all the techniques at his disposal to curry Wu's favor, from sucking up with proclamations that the Medici and the Borgia are nothing but dust in his path to glory, to virtuosically playing the inherent paranoia of powerful leaders before declaring himself to be the solution to all their problems. But, great Wu, there is brute rumor of dystopia in your meta kingdom of Amarasiopia. I am your man, Megasire. Even here are overtones of historiographical double entendre. When Machiavelli tells Wu that he is the rising sun in the east and the setting sun in the west, I underscore the words by bringing back the music of chaos from earlier. After all, back in the 200s, Shanghai, Nanjing, and the YRD, our southern capital, vied for supremacy over all of China with the establishment of the state of Wu, whose rulers famously went by the surname of Sun. Even though in chapter 23 of The Prince, Machiavelli advises his rulers against flatterers. He warns them. These people would seek to subvert measured action with rash intuition born of manipulation. But he seems to have no problem using this tactic to his own advantage. Well, I enjoy my puns. But we must remember that there's nothing cute or frivolous about Machiavelli's task to impress Wu and with his teachings and cause him to attend the lessons at hand. His job, as it was with the princes of old, is to give advice. If his advice fails or costs the prince dearly, then it would likely cost the advisor even more dearly. The livelihood and the life of the advisor depends on his wit and the ability of the prince to both grasp the lessons and excel at their implementation. So let's talk about the lessons. Just as in his book 1532, our reincarnated Machiavelli delineates a clear structure to the various lessons he hopes to impart in 2032. His first chapter, titled Why Princes Should Beware Revolutions, takes us far away from the technocratic order of Amarasiopia to an arena that is as chaotic and gritty as it is historically ever-shifting, as though by magic, only to underline essential, unchanging habits and truths. This sphere is punctuated by boisterous crowds, defined by the raw ideological battles and charismatic personalities that drive politics eternally. The setting conjured up by Machiavelli highlights the dialogues of people and their leaders. Crowds as organic, amoeba-like masses playing politics with their leaders as the fully immersive contact sport that it often is. At its center is one of the most unique and strange characters in this drama, the Prince of Revolution. This spinning, supernatural figure is the only entity in the show that doesn't represent a character based in history or a newly invented original character. The Prince of Revolution is a model, a conceptual vessel, if you like, and it gets filled with the spirits of destructive revolutionaries and their ever-familiar cults of followers. As the Prince of Revolution transforms from the mesmerizing voice of Savonarola to the high-pitched yet guttural countertenor of Hitler, to the delicate but terrifying incantations of Mao, one constant theme remains, an undying moralization, a steadfast conviction that the world is fundamentally broken and that only a radical cleansing, a baptism by fire, can purify it. Both the Prince of Revolution and his firebrand followers are enthralled with their persuasion that this path forward is the only viable one. They unflinchingly believe that they are on the right side of history, as though history ever had sides. Machiavelli must show President Wu that history is not a straight line, and that societies do not progress linearly to anywhere, up or down, that that's an illusion. His task is to show his leader that the anthology of human experience is a circle, a wave, a recursive function, that occasionally but inevitably comes back to where it began and starts again towards the same dysfunction. He must teach Wu to resist the temptation of attempting to unite his factious state by indulging in revolutionary panache that gallivants the statecraft. But if Savonarola's pious weepers, Hitler's cheering throngs, and Mao's dedicated Red Guards reveal anything to us, it is that this is not about statecraft. This act is about shattering the establishments of court and state, fueled in equal parts by a fatalistic cynicism, deep distrust for the institutions of governance, feelings of furious disenfranchisement, and plain, dumb, blunt ignorance. These are not the crowds making demands for more representation in 2011's Tahrir Square, nor the masses standing up against a tyrant like Bashar al-Assad in Syria. This is an angry throng of people being emboldened to run free, to play with their newfound fire, avid for destruction, complete, voluptuous, and final destruction. This is the terrifyingly familiar fascist desire to tear it all down and somehow make it great again. The choreography that unites the three episodes of Savonarola, Hitler, and Mao is the symbolically heavy action of recursive history, constant book burning. But it is important to remember that Savonarola, in his horrifying bonfire of the vanities, did not limit himself to burning books. From his perceived moral high ground, he menacingly warned the princes of old, spinning his voice in a mesmerizing wail. "O Italy, O princes, O prelates of the church, the wrath of God is upon you. Neither is there any hope for you unless you convert to the Lord. Repent you before the sword be unsheathed." History is indeed recursive. Starting in February 1495, over 5 full centuries before the world was introduced to the horrors of Daesh, ISIL. Savonarola led his followers in chaotic scenes where they would burn anything that they found heretical or objectionable. Irreplaceable manuscripts and works of art were lost for all eternity. Books were torched with impunity. Eventually, in a chilling premonition of Heinrich Heine's famous assertion that where they have burned books, they will end up in burning human beings, People were not spared. Prostitutes were beaten ruthlessly. Homosexuals were led into the fire and burned alive. Savonarola and his followers, in a desperate, mad yearning for a perverse form of salvation, turned Florence into a vision of hell itself. The pyre of rage and desire transforms way too easily into the Mussolini-inspired beer hall putsch in Munich, 1934. The Prince of Revolution cavorts now in the brown shirt of Adolf Hitler. The familiar vision of book burners who would torch human beings surround him. They feed their now industrial bonfire with human fuel, the same heady mix that proclaims that we can all be cleansed with politics. One final transformation, and we shift to the lights of Beijing in the mid-1960s. The crowd is dressed once again uniformly, but this time in gray suits. They wield red books and put dunce caps on bourgeois traitors before the still and ever-roaring bonfire. The Prince of Revolution now assumes the figure of the most prolific mass murderer in history, Mao Zedong, the example of this man whose murderous accomplishment would be the combined effort of Hitler and Stalin, seems to have no deterrent effect on my Wu virtue. His reaction even contains a tinge of admiration. And I quote, "Great men sometimes make great mistakes, but they must dare and do. That is the essence of what we call virtue." If anything, he seems to admire their daring. Vital lessons remain constantly unlearned, and history remains repetitive in its dysfunction. For a second warning against the lure of rushing to revolution, the scene shifts to Tahrir Square and an exploration of an organically different form of uprising, fueled in equal measure by idealism and rage. The people of Egypt demanded the removal of Hosni Mubarak's 30-year-old regime. The images of demonstrations and youth revolutions in 2011's Tahrir Square have since become iconic emblems of what some refer to as the Arab Spring. Though the events of the uprising that have rocked and continue to rock the cradle in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Syria, and other Arab states undoubtedly introduced new voices into the global fugue, I have resisted referring to the events taken together as a spring. The series of destabilizations, some uprisings, some invasions, some civil wars have simply involved too much bloodshed to be considered a flourishing spring. The deterioration of Iraq and Syria, two central Arab states, cannot be referred to as an Arab awakening either. The implication that the people of these nations, long ravaged by decades of war and bad governance, were somehow asleep the whole time and have only now awakened is insulting. As a composer, I know that Iraq and Syria have been awake for millennia as the crucible of Arab and indeed human civilization. It was in Baghdad that al-Kindi wrote the first serious treatise on musical composition that the West had seen since the Dark Ages engulfed Europe and the West. And it was Aleppo that gave Greater Syria and the greater Arab world one of the most vibrant traditions of classical music that humanity has ever seen. The events have wreaked heartbreaking destruction on Aleppo and Baghdad and considerable destabilization on Cairo. Traditionally, these cities, together with Damascus and Beirut, have been the center of Arab culture, so much so that I would refer to this spring as the Arab Troubles, or at least the Arab Revolutions, or the Arab Autumn, if you want a season, insist on a season. Though Machiavelli has constructed a lesson on these particular revolutions in our drama, I would hasten to add my own perspective, which is that these events simply cannot be appreciated at the present time. We are too immediately close to them, Revolutions often have to evolve and proceed as societies do over decades rather than years. Our scene can tell the tale of folly, the folly of hastily and impulsively turning the page in Egypt, only to then hand the country over to the Muslim Brotherhood and Mohammed Morsi, and the ill-equipped governance that they brought. Then it was only a matter of time before General Sisi rushes in to play the same role that Zia-ul-Haq and so many other historic generals have played, that of the haughty rescuer, appearing to save the nation with military precision and discipline from the chaotic mess of mediocre politicians. But in order for us to gauge the wider effects of these revolutions, we must step back and reassess them all after they play themselves out more fully. As we stand back, we must remember that revolutions are not all cut from the same cloth. The American Revolution, for example, was a relatively good revolution, turned out well, while the French Revolution took much longer to work through its seemingly endless bloodshed and counteractions before a stable, coherent society began to emerge. There are, however, some keys to understanding the challenges of these uprisings by contrasting these nations with the Arab Gulf states, those that are at the heart of the aforementioned rise and rise of Arab Gulf cities. Some notable differences may be enlightening. First is, of course, the fact that the historically central Arab states, such as Egypt and Syria, have exponentially larger populations, while possessing considerably less financial wealth. Second has been a commitment over long term to good governance, infrastructure, and the creation of opportunities in the Gulf that has been lacking or overshadowed by rampant corruption and bureaucracy in the historically central states. Lastly, and I would say most importantly, the Gulf states have been fortunate to have developed and adapted in a self-determined way their own democratic systems of government that are rooted organically in the historic tribal nations, a nature of Gulf societies. While nations like Egypt and Syria have long struggled with the authoritarian regimes that functioned as the long tail of colonial rule. In the spirit of tribal democracy, I would like to refer to a well-loved elder. Back in 2011, at the height of the Arab uprisings, my friend David Ignatius paid a visit to Prince Saud al-Faisal at his palace in Riyadh. When David asked the prince for his perspective on this tumultuous socio-political landscape, Saud offered the words of a sage man. He said, "It is a great transformation in the Arab world. It is happening in different ways in different countries for different reasons. The similarity is lack of attention to the will of the people by the governing bodies, and an assumption that they can go on neglecting the will of the people because they control the situation. But you can never avoid what the people want, no matter what government you have." Prince Saud simply concluded that the future of these nations was uncertain, but he importantly added, whatever decision they take, it will be their decision. Now for something completely different. Machiavelli's second chapter attempts something more intimate. Turning to Wu's private life in a lesson titled Why Princes Must Control or Conceal Their Human Desires, Machiavelli conjures up the examples of two exquisite statesmen, Alexander Hamilton and Bill Clinton, whose careers, in the estimation of our Machiavelli, are tarnished by the scandal of what people saw as their sexual improprieties becoming public. Wu Vertu is hesitant to witness the twin novella that his ancient counselor has prepared for him, with protestations like, "A man's private parts belong to his private life, surely." Well, here I agree with Wu. It is important to note at this point that Machiavelli is not a liberal nor a progressive thinker. He is concerned with giving guidance that will enable a ruler to hold on to power, no matter what the circumstances, His aim is to see the world as it is. And this cements Machiavelli's place in my mind as the godfather of Realpolitik, possessed with an ultimately cynical and dark view of humanity. He's not concerned with fixing or even addressing the ills of society in realistic ways, but rather he focuses on exploring how social realities and the status quo can be manipulated to further the goals of the pursuit of power. He wants to work the system, right? Rather than reform its flaws or refine it. While this approach is serviceable for the immediate here and now, for 5 or 10-year periods, for the tenure of a presidency, or even for a generation or two, I'm going to argue that it can have world-breaking consequences when we consider the long arc of history. After all, it is harder to work for social justice and to invest in a fight against lazy shame by working for the engendering of pride than to embrace real life as it is. But the politics of shame is not just counterproductive and useless, it's also actively destructive. It takes more discipline for societies to control their paparazzi-like desires, to sniff at other people's bedsheets and obsess over the private lives of public figures. Yes, even the most public figures have private lives and are entitled to that if they want it. The gossip's finger and wagging tongues may make for good tabloids and provide fodder for discussion to an eminently bored population, but we must realize that these sorts of stories contribute to a culture of public shaming that is deeply unsettling. I've always viewed human sexual expression as an essential part of humanity's genius. It encompasses dizzying creative diversity in its many cultural manifestations across the globe. It's a vital form of communication between consenting individuals, but it is not ordinary communication. It can be searingly intense and deeply intimate. It is often also indescribably personal. What people, no matter how public, do in the privacy of their own homes should not be subject to the unwanted scrutiny and judgment of uninvited observers. And it is especially unnerving to me when I see shame being wielded as a political tool to bring down people in power when their private sexual practices have no bearing on their policymaking or public works and do not impinge on the lives of anyone other than their own and their partners. If we did not tolerate the politics of shame or indulge in its self-destructive scandal-mongering circus, then the atmosphere that caused Bill Clinton to even feel the need to lie about his sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky would not have existed. Nor would the social atmosphere in which James Reynolds, the husband of Alexander Hamilton's illicit lover, was able to bribe Hamilton. These are two different situations, time periods, and set of circumstances, to be sure. But the root problem boils down to the same basic concept, shame. In fact, the word shame appears with more frequency in this twinned lesson of Hamilton and Clinton than any other single word appears in any other act of our drama. The shaming begins with the journalists of Hamilton's time, a sort of 18th century paparazzi brigade, sniffing at Hamilton's bedsheets, singing a cruel mockery with references to his youth. Bastard boy, a nose as long as his leg, and always sticking his peg into a new pudding. These words are linked to Hamilton's main aria, in which, while laying in bed with his wife Eliza, he seems to awaken in a cold sweat. It soon becomes clear that he is not awake at all, but experiencing a nightmare that brings out his deepest fears and vulnerabilities of being taunted, humiliated, and abandoned. He fears love itself because he is convinced that love is lost and what is dear will disappear.
Bastard boy, bastard boy, son of the whore of the Caribbean. Bastard boy, I hear the lads on St. Nevis, son of the whore of the Caribbean. Abandoned by my father at 11, my mother died of fever when I was 12. Abandoned, dead, alone, penniless, without a friend or protector. Love is lost. Love is lost. What is dear will disappear.
The rumors continue while Hamilton attends to the business of government in Philadelphia. When he finds himself in the hands and the arms of his mistress, Maria Reynolds, we see her underscored by this musical motif. It's always steady, even deliberate, and repeats the same predictable pattern of 4 notes that seeps seductively ever downwards, as if to tell you that she knows exactly what she's doing. The words, too, play on what Machiavelli would like to demonstrate to President Wu, Hamilton's weaknesses, are being exposed, playing on his vulnerabilities and fear of loss. Maria Reynolds beckons him to come to my arms, as though comforting him for the early trauma of losing his mother. And she plays on his early mortification of being mocked, son of a whore of the Caribbean, with the chillingly piercing, do I look like your mother? Above all, in being caught, she gives him the temporary release from his shame. After this, the repetitive 4-note musical figure continues together with a steady speeding up of the tempo. It imitates the visceral repetition and increase in pulse of the sexual act itself. as it intensifies and reaches climax. This is a different sort of universality than the cosmopolitan globalism of the Amero-Ethiopian musical style. Here we experience the primitive side of music, the aspect that encompasses basic rhythm and tone as pulse and the beating of the human heart. In the end, Hamilton pursues the only way he has to escape. He publishes his shame to the world, leaving no detail, however sordid, unsaid, so that the blackmailers would have nothing more to torment him with. It is the same sad rite of shame that we would witness so many times over the several long decades that follow. With the passage of centuries, the ceremony is repeated in the second part of Machiavelli's lesson, when in the aftermath of Bill Clinton's exposure, we are confronted with the cacophony of 1,000 reporters squawking and cell phones ringing and the pandemonium of uncovering and humiliation. The president is assaulted by a sea of microphones, by people demanding the same ritual of confession and apology. I remember watching the spectacle of President Clinton's entire saga unfold while in my early teens. I remember my parents explaining to me some of the things that were going on that I didn't necessarily yet understand. I also remember a deep distaste in my household for how the scene was being publicly played out in the most politically motivated way possible. For the 22-year-old intern, too, an affair that should have been private business between her boss, and their families quickly became a worldwide phenomenon, fueled by the digital stone throwing that has become a sad characteristic of the internet age. Monica Lewinsky addressed the experience vividly in her TED Talk titled The Price of Shame. This was all in the nascent days of the late 90s, when it was still unusual for a story to be broken online instantaneously and indiscriminately without the proper vetting of a traditional credentialed press. Almost 2 decades later, the addition of social media has exacerbated the situation to the point where in 2010, a young teenager who I had the pleasure of judging on recording, who played as concertmaster in the Bergen Youth Orchestra and had all the potential of a full life ahead of him, was viciously and relentlessly humiliated online after his roommate at Rutgers University secretly filmed him being intimate with another man. Being placed in this online stockade was too much for the 19-year-old, who was far less equipped than a public figure might be to handle. And so Tyler Clementi jumped off the George Washington Bridge to his death. His jump was motivated by shame and humiliation. So today, in 2016, it is truly uninspiring to see the vilest politicians and wannabe politicians brazenly dig up the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal in order to self-interestedly reinfect the body politic of the nation with this discourse of the politics of shame. Even the most with it and mature people, even the most public figures, even presidents and first ladies, yes, even people with skins as thick as Bill and Hillary Clinton are human beings and deserve to be able to draw boundaries in their private lives. In President Clinton's address in August of 1998, I remember how he cited as the first motivation for misleading people when answering questions that were being asked within the context of a politically motivated lawsuit, a desire to protect myself from the embarrassment of my own conduct. But I also remember how he simply and candidly said that even presidents have private lives. It is time to stop the pursuit of personal destruction and the prying into private lives and get on with our national life. Some may see this as political maneuvering, and indeed it might have been on some level, but it's also fundamentally true. Machiavelli may have thought it wise for a leader to conceal their desires and work the societal status quo. But for my part, I believe we can also work in the truer sense of that word towards change, so that we find ourselves being able to celebrate all the advancements that my generation has made in replacing the politics of shame with the dialogue of pride, while also protecting our right to private lives, so that we can communicate our sexual expression freely without stepping on anyone or being imposed upon ourselves. In the end, the miracle of human genius and creativity might find its most intimate and personal form of expression in sex. I embrace the infinite variety of human sexuality, from the most surreal fantasies one can encounter in Tokyo's Kabukichi district to the endless variations of monogamous and polygamous relationships. Most other animals, incidentally, spurn monogamy altogether. One can encounter in every culture on our beautiful planet. By respecting the intimacy of sex and not intruding upon our fellow human beings, we're not only insisting that organizations from political lobbies to governments and even human rights organizations are not able to take a moral high ground over others and insist on legislating one monolithic form of sexual experience as being correct. We're also endorsing the idea of allowing our fellow human beings room to experience and express themselves more liberally, openly, and honestly. And now, the final chapter. Fear and Love. It's a testament that Machiavelli writes, and I think it's his most urgent one. Why princes should avoid a clash of civilizations. Here, the idea of maintaining peace in the face of mutually assured civilizational destruction is the pragmatic way that overrides his advice to the Medici back in chapter 14 of The Prince, that a prince must have no other objective, no other thought, nor take up any profession but that of war. After all, this is no ordinary war. The stakes are much, much higher. This is a war that would tear apart the very glue of life and that would break the world in two. Avoiding it will, for Woover too, as for us, take self-awareness, intelligence, and calm, sentient analysis of our actions and assessments, not only of others, but also of ourselves. I've often urged those who would speak of a clash of civilizations to look at the musical technique of counterpoint. Good counterpoint involves distinct musical voices, coming together, but not losing their individuality, their own raison d'etre, their own purpose for being. It seems like an ideal model for the cultures of the world to live in counterpoint with one another. Rather than losing their individual voices, they enhance the whole collective. They form a beautiful tapestry of counterpoint. Good counterpoint is also, by the way, one of the most difficult techniques to master in all of music. It's not simply a matter of getting this to go with that. It involves laws and rules that prevent a single voice from getting lost or another voice from hegemonizing the others. Good counterpoint also contains a healthy amount of dissonance. How boring would music be without the variety that dissonance provides? In this act of our drama, two men acting and reacting to one another are fully convinced that their cause is a just and necessary one, that the ends of their actions will provide the world with a justice that justifies their weapons and means. This is the act where the figure of Osama bin Laden plots and realizes the vision that so vividly presented itself on September 11th, 2001, and where a segment of American leadership embodied by Dick Cheney decide that the reaction will involve whatever it takes to defeat these terrorists. This, of course, is exactly the reaction that the likes of bin Laden wanted. After all, the men of al-Qaeda understood very well that America could not be defeated by planes or the wanton massacre of a few thousand innocents. Bin Laden understood the fact that there was no force on earth that was powerful enough to destroy America except for America itself. frayed alliances, and causing the United States to act in a way that would cause billions of people to be alienated? Well, yeah, that was exactly what he was going for. In a monologue taken from his own words, his so-called letter to the Americans, bin Laden issues a warning that harkens back to a figure who existed 5 centuries ago. We call on you to stop your oppression, lies, immorality, and debauchery. We call you to be a people of manners, principles, honors, and purity, to reject the immoral acts of fornication, homosexuality, intoxicants, gambling, and usury. It saddens me, too, to say that you are the worst civilization witnessed in history. The overtones of Savonarola's ancient words are palpable. Repent you before the sword be unsheathed. What succeeds this is a depiction of the sad history that followed. The destruction wreaked on 9/11, America's overreaching response, including the rush to unnecessary and counterproductive wars, and the resort to torture, the belief that the weapons must be hard when the ends are so just. The eventual operation that kills bin Laden sees him immolated into the figure of the Prince of Revolution. And his spirit is joined to the spirits of those united in that terrifying visage. In the final summa, a duet between Dick Cheney and Osama bin Laden, they sing precisely the same words, but here I use a contrapuntal device known as a canon. Think row, row, row your boat. This device is one of the strictest in all music and involves 2 or more voices imitating one another, separated by a temporal interval. It is not a coincidence that the word canon in music, representing the strictest laws of counterpoint, also connotes a law or criteria by which something is judged, or the way in which human genius is declared. The Western canon, the Eastern canon, whatever, and organized, canon of works, or the way in which a saint is inducted. It has the marks of something highly organized, by a set of established laws. It's not a coincidence either that the word canon comes from the Arabic word kanun, which means law.
I was strong, virtue was my guide. I did the right, people followed. Virtue was my guide. The weapons must be hard when the ends are so just. I did
duet progresses, what began as a strict canon, what you just heard, begins to unravel with the voices moving further and further apart. This breaking of the canon is a literal representation of the breaking of law, the transgression against established values that eventually leads to the prevalence of chaos over order. Here, Cheney is in embracing the torture that is vividly shown on stage, transgresses against the secular values of the United States, while bin Laden, through his terrorization of the innocent, transgresses against the sacred values of Islam. Both are convinced of the old Machiavellian adage that if we must choose between being feared and loved, then it is safer to choose to be feared. But figures who fuel the fires of clash of civilizations understand the vital role that fear itself must play in any clash. And not all counterproductive rhetoric and action is poisonous or has poisonous intent. Let me give you a couple of examples. Let's take, for example, this particularly fascinating phenomenon that's resulted from well-meaning observers trying to turn down the volume between the Muslim world and the West by consistently explaining that Islam is a religion of peace. The thing about this chorus is that it should really go without saying. It's common sense. Of course, the vast majority of Muslims and Westerners in the world are peaceful people. There are over 1.5 billion Muslims on the planet today. And depending on how you define the West, a couple of billion people living in the West, in Western nations. That's a lot of people with advanced armies and the possession of nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction on both sides. If all these people, or a majority of them, or at least a significant minority of them, were fixed and resolved on destroying each other, then there would be no West or Muslim world to speak of. The clearest indication that a clash of civilizations is not happening is the fact that the world is not in total flames. No matter how much it may seem like it is from watching CNN or on a particularly masochistic day, Fox News. I've seen statements in the US by well-meaning intellects in our community who warn that an increasingly anti-Muslim rhetoric of hate and violence, basically calling for a war on Islam or a war on Muslims, is akin to Nazi Germany's horrific subjugation of the Jews during the Second World War. Though there are some striking rhetorical resemblances to various fascist movements in the oratory of the GOP, as well as radical jihadis, the analogy is inelegant. Waging a war on Islam or a war on the West isn't a matter akin to Germany's persecution of its Jewish population during the Holocaust, no matter what the GOP or the jihadis would like us to think. We're not dealing with the tragic deaths of millions of people here in the sick drive to annihilate a race and thus cleanse a society. Despite the presence of many of the same symptoms of the disease that we observed back when we dissected our Prince of Revolution, the effects of this illness will be far more devastating in its scope and its reach. Today we're talking about literally billions of people on both sides that make up more than half of the world's population. If the majority of them, as I said, were not peaceful, if the majority of them wanted to destroy one another, we'd know it, and it would be evidenced by the fact that the world would no longer exist. We're not talking about subjugation here, we are talking about mutually assured destruction. Here we must appreciate that the destruction of any civilization cannot come exclusively from without. This includes the West. And this dangerous idea of civilizational clash enfolds and menaces not just the West and the Muslim world, but all the great civilizations of the world at once. Remember the courage of Wu Jiamin reacting to the increasingly shrill and triumphalist drums of jingoism by advising his younger Chinese diplomats that we must be clear that populism is essentially against reform and nationalism is essentially against opening up. It is that sort of candor that needs to take the place of the reflexive China bashing, to say nothing of bashing Americans' allies in Europe and the Gulf on the campaign trails of Western politicians. It is not weakness for leaders to be honest with their citizens and explain that there is no sense in thinking about an infinite number of American centuries to come. The very nature of our hyper-interconnected globe will make the idea of a unipolar world untenable in the very near future. New thinking is needed. The twin cities of Abu Dhabi and Dubai, continuing to merge and emerge as one of the most important global megalopolises of the 21st century. China manifesting itself as a major power. India continuing on its path towards massive infrastructural growth, and harnessing its immense creative human capital, all these things do not need to translate into the decline of the West, unless the West actively chooses this. Western nations can choose, through vacuous and parochial movements that represent the very worst of populism, to relegate themselves to a slow and steady decline. But no terrorist group can do that without the consent of the nations that they seek to terrorize. The alternative is to ditch the nostalgic sun never sets mentality and realize the need to play in the sandbox with the other nations of the world. The empires of the past are a thing of the past. The attitudes that inform them now need to be relegated to the past for the sake of the continued influence of Western nations, if nothing else. The rest of the world is going to move on and move forward, no matter what. In short, the emergence of important centers of commerce and culture in the Arabian Gulf can benefit rather than impinge on the commerce and culture of Europe and American cities. The fact that the following decades may bring us to a place where we are faced with the reality of a Chinese century does not mean that this very same century cannot also be an American century. In fact, with the increased potential for trade cooperation and communication to happen at a faster pace than ever before, this century could be the greatest and most lucrative and most prosperous American century, in addition to being the same for so many other nations. Bin Laden may have intended to attack the symbolic trinity of political, military, and economic power of the United States by targeting the White House, the Pentagon, and the World Trade Center, respectively, thus exposing what he considered America's weaknesses. Its weak foundations, But only the last of the trinity contains the word world and the global ramifications that come with it. The last is the key to shining the light on truly insidious plans to destabilize civilization itself. The architect of the Twin Towers, Minoru Yamasaki, summed up best what those who would drive our civilizations to clash would seek to attack when he described his intentions behind the towers. I feel this way about it, said the architect. World trade means world peace. And consequently, the World Trade Center buildings in New York had a bigger purpose than just to provide room for tenants. The World Trade Center is a living symbol of man's dedication to world peace. Beyond the compelling need to make this a monument to world peace, the World Trade Center should become a representation of man's belief in humanity, his need for individual dignity, his beliefs in the cooperation of men, and through cooperation, his ability to find greatness. Just as a clash of civilizations presents us with the specter of mutually assured destruction, flipping the coin and taking advantage of the unprecedented tools at our disposal for international cooperation, the counterpoint of civilizations, presents us with the potential for mutually assured prosperity and peace, the likes of which we have never seen before. We can have all of this and more, but we have to take off our armor. We have to be courageous. We have to reject fear and begin the much harder process of building. JFK defined the folly of any peace that is not contrapuntal in nature back in 1963 when he was speaking at American University. He addressed what he described as the most important topic on earth, peace. But peace is too general, a notion to describe the highest aspirations of human beings, raising their voices in counterpoint. This peace had to be one, like Beethoven's Alle Menschen werden Brüder, of universal brotherhood. So I'll refer to JFK. What kind of peace do I mean? And what kind of peace do we seek, JFK said. Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. In the decades since JFK delivered that speech, many of our great diplomats and artists alike from across the globe have discarded of the myopic idea of a Pax Americana or a Pax Britannica, etc. The best have been working for the only sort of sustainable peace, and that must be a peace of harmony and counterpoint, the type of peace embodied in our highest ideal, a universal peace, a Pax Universalis. I am talking about genuine peace, continues Kennedy, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, and the kind that enables nations and men to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely a peace for Americans, but a peace for all men and women, not merely a peace in our time, but a peace in all time. The poles of fear and love are at the center and the heart of Machiavelli's teachings. And they're at the center of the human experience. In fact, one of the initial working titles for our drama, if you remember, David, was Fear and Love. Over time, we have diminished the power of diplomacy and cross-cultural understanding by using the term soft power. These words are pejorative. They suggest that the power of love is somehow weaker than the power of intimidation. And that just isn't true. The power to build and inspire people, that's the power to lead and change the world, and it's not soft. That's as hard as it gets. Writing in 2004, following Israel's assassination of Ahmad Yassin, leader of the terrorist group Hamas, David wrote, there is a deeper issue, one that goes to the heart of Israel's dilemma and dealing with the Arabs. Sharon symbolizes the belief that the Palestinians can be intimidated by military force, and that peace will only be possible when they are sufficiently weakened and humbled. If Israel is tough enough, by this logic, it will eventually break the Arabs, and they'll be forced to accept Israel's right to exist. That rationale, continues David, sent Israeli tanks rolling into Lebanon 22 years ago, in an operation Sharon believed would break the PLO and open the way to peace. But it didn't work out that way, and many Israelis now agree that the Lebanon war was a costly failure. It would be fatuous to give Israelis advice about their security. They live under the shadow of terrorism, and they must find their own solution. But they should consider the evidence of more than 2 decades that Sharon's approach isn't working. Rather than being humbled into submission, the Palestinians have embraced a strategy of suicidal rage. How will this gruesome cycle of violence end? Today, that's impossible to answer. But perhaps both sides could begin by considering the possibility that Machiavelli was wrong. Sometimes it may actually be safer to be loved than feared. An Israel that took risks for peace might find unexpected rewards, end quote. And so it's true, not only for Israel, but for all of us, and the Palestinians, and the whole world. Perhaps Machiavelli gave his princes this advice because he was a deeply flawed thinker. Maybe he just did it because it's easier to impose fear and infinitely harder to build trust and bring about love. Today, the stakes are too high to take that old, easy road. As Auden wrote on September 1st, 1939, with the penetrating directness that only a great poet can manage, we must love one another or die. In our final moments, in our final act, the polar opposite of bin Laden and Dick Cheney appears in the figure of Prince Saud al-Faisal, who incants an azan-like aria that is the credo of the entire opera. The words are taken directly from an address he delivered in Rabat, also in 2004. The musical rhythm captures the deliberate, struggled meter of a man suffering from Parkinson's. The words are so precious because they require so much energy to realize. The melody mixes the ancient Arabian mode of Bayati with the solemnly beautiful, plain, and unadulterated human voice that is the sound of the muezzin's call to prayer. His words are the moral core of our drama, the credo. I believe there can never be a clash of civilizations between us. It is a contradiction in terms. Civilizations are not competing products in the marketplace, but rather the collective effort of human genius, built on cumulative contributions from many cultures. We are all indebted to the ingenuity of great men like Locke, Bacon, Rousseau, Goethe. Who can deny the effects of the great Greek philosophers on our civilization, or the role of such Islamic thinkers as Avicenna, Al-Razi, Ibn al-Haytham, and Ibn Rushd in keeping the flames of human knowledge burning during the darkest ages, let alone the shining beacons of knowledge from India and China. So no, civilization cannot be monopolized by any single nation or creed. So I believe. And so I believe. Ladies and gentlemen, I am 30 years old. My hope is that I have a few decades ahead of me. The world that I want to live in will not be governed by fear. It won't be governed by ignorance, and it won't be governed by chaos. My sincere hope is that my generation will choose the harder path, one that is defined by the prerequisites of humility, curiosity, acceptance, respect, the embrace of diversity, and the commitment to understanding. The alternative to that, with all due respect, is not realism. It is cynicism. And we should never mistake cynicism for intelligence. If we make the truly intelligent, truly realistic choices, even though they be harder, then we have the tools to be on our way to the greatest renaissance that humanity has ever seen. Thank you very much. Thank you. I have two housekeeping things before I let you go. First of all, I didn't want to break the idea, but I did want to acknowledge a few people. It's very important. And secondly, I do want to invite you to offer a couple of questions to David, Ignatius, and myself, if you have any. I want to thank David Rothkopf for his support and kindness. Want to sincerely thank Libby Franklin and the Aspen Institute and Peter Kaplan and all the souls at the Institute for putting together this incredible Festival of Ideas. What a beautiful concept. I want to thank Alan Fletcher. Alan, are you here? No? And the Aspen Music Festival for their help putting these performances together. Carla, Dirlikov, my friend, Ken Merrill, Micah Schroeder, and Michael Hewitt, the wonderful performers. Can we give them a round of applause, please? Now, Opera America, Pure Music. A few people whose advice helped me to realize this article: Noor El-Kabi, Yusuf El-Utaiba, Zaki Nusseibeh, Bill Bragan, and Mohammed Kanu. And of course, last but not least, certainly not least, my collaborator and cherished friend, David Ignatius, for writing a libretto that has allowed me to take this journey into bringing these diverse thoughts and figures to life, but also for following my indecipherable and often quite mad process with patience and curiosity. Thank you, David. Anyone have questions? David, do you want to come up?
Well, if there are any, yes, of course.
Well, there are people asking questions. You have to come up.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
I'll wait for you to get up there, David.
Okay. I'll leave my umbrella.
Shall I vamp you on the piano while you come? No.
I have a question about leadership and sort of the populist approach that we see in our culture. I'm struck by the work of Noam Chomsky, who talks in his work of the death of the American dream, that the great chasm between the haves and the have-not that we see playing out in our culture, and that the only thing that can really break the system, if you will, is a revolution. And so we see lots of different revolutions that are playing out in our world, and certainly on the American scene, at least 2 or 3 different revolutions in this current political context. And so my question is about leadership and the populist approach. Some would argue that populist approach is really a great approach to leadership because it's giving voice to the concerns and the needs that the people have. And so the task of the leader is to discern what the needs, concerns, angers, fears are of the people and to do something about it. And so we see this being played out in a lot of different ways. And my question is, when is the populist approach leadership, and when is it really the collapse of leadership?
Well, I'll take a start, but let me first begin by thanking Mohammed for the beautiful music that we listened to and for his thoughts about this project that we've worked so hard on. It was a wonderful evening. We're living in a period where populism is exploding in the candidacy of Donald Trump, in the anger of British voters voting to leave a European Union that the Google search box says they weren't sure they knew what it was. I think what this opera says is that revolutions of whatever description, populist revolutions, revolutions through history, start off being lovable, start off being noble, transcendent, capturing the righteous anger of people, but as they age, they become like children who start off lovable, increasingly less so. And they end up often devouring themselves. They become their opposite. And the passages that Mohammed described from the opera make that argument. Leadership, our country needs leadership so badly. Leadership that will reflect the anger that people feel, but also will give it a real focus. And we're going to see in these next few months whether our country has the ability to create and elect leaders who take us in a good direction. But like you, I'm haunted by the question. I unfortunately have to write about it twice a week, so I have the regular experience of frustration. But Mohammed, what do you think?
About populism as being when does it stop being? When do the revolutions stop being righteous? And I think almost universally, people have some righteous concerns, even very angry people. Even the worst of these sorts of historic revolutions, some of them had these sort of righteous concerns. Even Hitler's, and obviously in these instances, they came to a place where it got out of control. And violence is often the barrier. The barrier of fear being broken into violence. That's often one way of knowing that if it's inciting violence, then maybe we need to tone it down a little bit. The other thing is that look at, America is an incredible nation that has a stunning history of its own democracy. But that doesn't mean that it can't also look at successful models in younger nations that have good examples of governance, and vice versa. And I think with that humility and learning from other people, just as they learn from America, that can produce great results, in my opinion. I also, frankly, I'm going to say something that's a little bit unpopular. I guess I'm fine with that, is that there are some things that people are not equipped to do in terms of governance and statecraft and diplomacy. And the average person shouldn't be doing it without training. And we have ambassadors, we have, an entire State Department. A lot of these people are brilliant people. They've studied or worked. These career diplomats are, there is an elite. It's always been part of not only the history of governance and statecraft, the history of music, the history of everything has involved people who are good at doing what they do. I'm not going to, you're a small gathering of very small, intimate gathering of people who got subjected to my voice tonight. But I'm not going to subject the Opera House in Amsterdam to my voice and my singing on recording when there are people like this doing it.